Greetings from Project Hindsight to fellow astrologers at the St. Petersburg Astrological Conference. My name is Robert Schmidt, and I would like to give you a glimpse of some of the riches we have uncovered through the translation and study of Hellenistic astrological texts. But first of all, let me define what I mean by Hellenistic astrology. By this term, I mean the kind of astrology that appeared sometime after the Alexandrian conquest of Egypt in 332 BCE and sometime before the beginning of the Christian era. It is a bit difficult to pinpoint more exactly the precise time in which this material made its appearance. But it is current scholarly opinion that the writings that constitute the original Hellenistic astrological material were composed somewhere in the 2nd century before the Christian era. The authorship of those original writings is also quite mysterious. Their works are associated with a cast of semi-divine figures with names like Hermes Trismegistus, Asclepius, Anubis, Orpheus, and so forth. Now, in point of fact, we do not have very much material from those early astrologers, whom we will call the founding astrologers of Hellenistic tradition. Sometime shortly after the 2nd century BCE, there was a very large compilation of astrological material made by some equally mysterious persons, namely a man named Nechepso and another named Petersirus. I say that this is somewhat mysterious because Nechepso was in point of fact an Egyptian pharaoh, and Petersirus was a high priest, but they evidently lived at different eras. So these may have been fictional names for the actual authors of this apparently very large treatise. Nechepso and Petersirus were understood to be the explicators and expositors of the original material going back to Hermes Trismegistus and the other folks that I mentioned. However, this large compendium of astrological material itself did not survive intact. We do not have all of the volumes and all of the different books that were written by these two figures. What we know of their writing is primarily due to excerpts made by later authors and occasional paraphrases and just simple references that in many cases do not have a lot of content. In any case, this material that was formulated in this lost work by Nechepso Petersirus became the source of all the later Hellenistic astrological writings. The Hellenistic tradition could be understood to extend from this founding period, which I've mentioned, all the way up till perhaps the 7th century of the Christian era. Now, even though this covers the Roman period and part of the early Byzantine period, I still call it Hellenistic astrology for the simple reason that it has all of the earmarks of this original astrology and was not influenced by other traditions. This is to some extent like calling the work of William Lilly and the English school, who were writing during the end of the 1600s, medieval astrology, because the type of astrology that they are practicing is in fact medieval, a direct has a direct link to the medieval tradition and was not influenced by many of the revisionist tendencies that you will find in such writers as Kepler and the French astrologer Morin. So Hellenistic astrology, by this term, I mean the kind of astrology that was practiced in something like its pure and unadulterated form from approximately the 2nd century before the Christian era all the way up until about the 7th century. The Hellenistic astrology marks an entirely new beginning in the history of astrology. It's almost certainly the case that the Hellenistic astrologers got the idea for doing astrology from the Babylonians, or possibly from the pre-Hellenistic Egyptians, or perhaps from both of whom were practicing astrology in some form or other prior to the Hellenistic period. But during this Hellenistic era, a vast number of new concepts and techniques were introduced that cannot be traced back to either the Babylonian or pre-Hellenistic Egyptian antecedents. These contain such basic astrological concepts as houses, sign characteristics such as quadruplicities and triplicities, and masculine and feminine signs, aspect doctrine, timing procedures such as transits, secondary progressions, and also directive procedures, and also the study of solar returns, plus quite a few other basic matters that are still part of astrological practice, although the original concepts may be understood differently in modern times. So this material, which is sort of recognizably astrology in the modern sense, was all introduced during this Hellenistic period. This is why we could, with some justice, say that Hellenistic astrology is the origin of all later Western astrology. This Hellenistic tradition had an enormous influence on the development of the Western astrological tradition. The material, much Hellenistic material, was translated into Arabic in the 8th century, either directly from Greek sources or through Persian intermediate translations. And for at least the first few centuries of the Arabian flowering of astrological practice, astrology was still, for all intents and purposes, Hellenistic astrology. I must say, however, that the Arabian astrologers evidently did not get all of the Hellenistic astrology that we possess today. The primary sources that they relied upon when they were formulating, formalizing, and schematizing their own astrology, the primary authors, Hellenistic authors, were Dorotheus of Sidon and Ptolemy. The problem with this is that Ptolemy is not exactly a representative Hellenistic astrologer. Although there is a lot of material in the Tetrabiblos, which is in fact traditional Hellenistic astrology, Ptolemy had his own agenda and discarded vast quantities of the earlier Hellenistic material and did not incorporate it into his own Tetrabiblos. So it is difficult to use Ptolemy as a typical representative of Hellenistic astrology. The other author who was highly influential during the Arabian period was Dorotheus. And Dorotheus does in fact have quite a lot of material that is traditional, or what I would call now traditional, that is representing the original Hellenistic form of astrology. But there's a problem with Dorotheus as well, which is that his work was written in verse, in didactic verse, and it's a relatively long was a relatively long poem. It unfortunately does not survive completely in Greek, but it was translated into Persian and from Persian into Arabic. So we already have an intermediary by the time Dorotheus gets to the Arabian astrologers. And because it was written in verse, it was also somewhat, no doubt, somewhat difficult for the Arabian translators to fully understand. Ptolemy is equally difficult to understand because he writes in an incredibly succinct and sort of architectonically compact manner, which can be difficult even for modern classicists who have a considerable knowledge of Greek. And if you add to that the fact that Ptolemy himself does not define much of the terminology that he uses in his actual exposition of astrological practice, you can see that however much the Arabian astrologers wanted to preserve the Hellenistic legacy, they were faced with a number of difficulties. We also know that there are several highly important Hellenistic texts that simply were not translated into Arabic, or if they did make it into Arabic, it was in some piecemeal fashion. The most important of these is the Anthology of Vettius Valens, which is the most comprehensive surviving Hellenistic astrological treatise that we have, and is an absolute goldmine of practical techniques and sort of sophisticated astrological thinking. Evidently, there was a translation of Valens done into Persian, but very little of that was able to make its way into the Arabic language. At least some of the most important parts of Vettius Valens, namely books 4, 5, and 6, which contain a very detailed and elaborate treatment of something that we call Time Lords. Time Lords are the Western analogs of the Hindu dasha systems. They are ways of assigning planetary rulers to spans or periods of time, and they were in fact at the heart of all Hellenistic predictive and timing techniques. Now, the fact that these Time Lord procedures mentioned by Valens in these books do not seem to be represented in any Arabian texts, or at least they haven't turned up as of the present day, is an indication that they did not get this material from Valens. And the Time Lords actually constitute a very central and important part of Hellenistic astrological thinking. My point is that we have two problems when the Hellenistic material gets into the Arab language. First of all, there were translation difficulties going from Greek, an Indo-European language, to Arabic, which belongs to a totally different language family, and also the Arabian astrologers did not have all of the material. Nevertheless, the Arabian astrologers were as faithful to their Hellenistic sources as they could be, given the precautionary remarks that I just enumerated. Now, the Arabian material, starting in the 12th and 13th century, was translated into medieval Latin, going back now into an Indo-European language. And from these medieval Latin translations, it was further translated into modern European languages. So you have, for instance, an English translation or an English treatise by William Lilly on astrology, which is effectively medieval astrology, even though it's of relatively late date. This type of astrology continued to survive during the so-called Enlightenment, although in a very degraded form. And so the 19th century astrologers had really only bits and pieces of the original Hellenistic tradition when it came time to to sort of orchestrate a new renaissance of astrology, which reaches its peak in the 20th century. As I mentioned before, concepts like houses, signs, aspects, timing methods like transits, progressions, and so forth were in fact originally introduced during the Hellenistic period. There is no evidence that Babylonian or pre-Hellenistic Egyptian astrologers used these devices. So some of this does in fact survive into modern times, where in the 20th century, Dane Rudhyar and other modern astrologers reconceptualized the foundations of astrology on the basis of what I would call the rags and tatters of what had survived in the original tradition. So modern astrology is still, in as far as its defining concepts and procedures, recognizably Hellenistic in origin, even though the framework in which these techniques and procedures and concepts were placed is radically and utterly different than the original Hellenistic one. Let me make one final little remark on the tail end of this little historical survey that I've given you. It is sometimes said by certain modern astrologers that who are somewhat familiar with the history of astrology that much of the original Hellenistic legacy was discarded by subsequent astrologers when they found that it didn't work. In other words, that the lack of the fact that much Hellenistic material is missing in modern astrology is not due to accidents of transmission, but rather to the fact that the astrologers just tested things out and found that a lot of the original material didn't work, so did not record it or report it. Nothing could be further from the case. The Arabian astrologers in particular lovingly preserved every little scrap of lore that they could lay their hands on, and they would never have simply discarded something because they could not themselves make it work. It would have been their opinion that if they were not able to make it work, it was because they had not understood the original material. This conservative tendency in preserving the astrological tradition continued well into the medieval Latin period. It was only during the period of the Renaissance that you have astrologers such as Kepler discarding huge amounts of the original legacy that had come down to him because he did not see how some of these rather strange and arcane medieval techniques wouldn't made any sense within anything resembling a scientific framework. However, in my opinion, that this is simply a measure of how far we have come from an understanding of the original framework that was underlying Hellenistic astrology beginning in the 2nd century BCE. I forgot to mention that Hellenistic astrology also left an unmistakable imprint on the indigenous astrology of India. At least that's what a lot of scholarship, current scholarship, would indicate. Of all the astrologies, Indian astrology and Hellenistic astrology are more like one another in terms of their spirit and practice than any other forms of astrology that either from the West or from the East. The problem of the influence of the Hellenistic material on India is violently disputed by many Indian astrologers, and certainly is a subject that will require quite a lot of scholarly research in the future. However, it's very hard to ignore the fact that the language that is used in the description of the houses in Indian astrology is simply transliterated terminology that comes from the Greek language, and the Greek terms for the same things. But as I said, this is not the time or the place to go into that scholarly thicket. I would like to give you some idea, a kind of survey of the surviving Hellenistic material and how I believe that it can be reorganized into a coherent system. If we peruse the surviving materials, and they're considerable, there are about 5 significant long treatises surviving in Greek or Latin. There are numerous shorter coherent treatises written on special subjects. There are many, many fragments drawn from other works or quoted by later authors. If we look over all of this material, we can see, I believe, what the original Hellenistic system looked like. First of all, there is always quite a lot of material, very elementary material, on the natures of the planets, the natures of the signs, the houses, planetary configurations, and so forth. The concepts that describe things like planetary combinations and the position of the planets in the zodiac and their house position and so forth suggests that these different concepts can be grouped together or clustered together in sort of meaningful groupings. I'll try to give you an idea about this a little later when I begin the practical part of this presentation. If we look over all of the actual techniques, we find that they can be divided into 3 classes, particularly if we pay careful attention to the material that survives in Vettius Valens. First of all, there are techniques that I would call, that I would say were universal in their import. This is not a term that Valens uses, but I think it's an appropriate one. What I mean by that is they are techniques that are designed to say something about the native's life as a whole, how eminent this individual will be, how happy he will be. And by the way, the Greek word for happiness is somewhat interesting. It's oidaimonia. Happiness is not understood by the Hellenistic astrologers to be a psychological condition where I'm happy and in a good mood. It actually means being blessed by a good daimon. Now, this is quite a different notion. It means that the native may or may not have all of the things that should constitute his happiness, gifts of wealth and health and children and so forth. Whether the individual will be happy in the modern sense belongs to a totally different Hellenistic study. I'm saying this because I need to emphasize that Hellenistic astrology is not based on a psychological model the way modern astrology is. It has often been characterized as event-oriented as opposed to person-centered, and there is some justice in that characterization, although ultimately it's a bit of a cartoon rather than an accurate description. Hellenistic astrology does study events, the events that befall human beings in their everyday life. But it also has the means of studying events that we would say are internal or inner events. And there's actually a very special study where you can determine what the Hellenistic astrologers would call the quality of soul and times of life during which one is subject to certain moods and what we might call personality distinctions between people and so forth. So this is in fact a part of Hellenistic astrology, but it is not the defining part. In other words, inner events are understood to be events just like any other event, and they can be studied according to the times in which they will begin and the evolutions that they will go through and when they are completed and so forth. So we need to be careful when we try to distinguish Hellenistic astrology from modern astrology along those lines. But it is certainly true that ancient astrology in general is just as much concerned about the likelihood of having children or relationships and wealth and all of the things that constitute being blessed by a good daimon as modern astrologers would be. But the distinction is very important. As a matter of fact, it's interesting to retrace the steps that someone like Dane Rudhyar followed when he took the original, or what survived of the original Hellenistic legacy, and then had to transform those concepts and techniques into a psychological or humanistic framework. Now, of these many works that do survive in Greek, as I've said, they can be broken up into classes, and the class that we're talking about now I call universal techniques, and they address such issues as the eminence of the individual, that is how highly visible he is in the world and to those persons around him, his happiness in the sense that I've defined it, and other such matters. Now, in addition to these techniques that address the life as a whole, there are a group of methods that are designed to investigate specific topics in the native's life, such as parents and children and travel and profession and so forth. And there are very specialized astrological techniques for addressing those subjects independently from the rest of the native's life. Finally, what you might call the third class of techniques and procedures is constituted by the Hellenistic doctrine of Time Lords, which, as I said earlier, are sort of the Hellenistic analogs or counterparts to the Hindu dasha systems. And there are actually maybe, depending on how you count variants, there are somewhere between 6 and 12 basic Hellenistic Time Lord systems surviving. And I would actually say that it is possible to arrange the different Time Lord procedures into a coherent system, so they are not simply 6 or 8 or 10 different ways of approaching timing. I can't emphasize enough the importance of the Hellenistic doctrine of Time Lords. When we rediscovered this in 1995, it was very exciting because this had always been the hallmark and defining feature of Indian astrology. The Hellenistic Time Lord procedures are not identical to the Indian dasha systems. The manner in which the planets are assigned rulership over blocks of time, and the amount of time that they receive as Time Lords or dasha lords are different in virtually every case. However, as I said earlier, the as far as timing is concerned, the Hellenistic astrologers also have transits, studied in something like the modern sense, and secondary progressions, studied in something like the modern sense, although unfortunately the evidence or the texts that deal with secondary progressions are very rare in the Hellenistic material. And they also have directive methods, which in Hellenistic astrology should probably be called circumambulations rather than directions, for reasons I won't go into right now. But there are some things that need to be said about these mainstays of modern astrological timing. First of all, the directive methods were originally not understood to time events, say to the moment. The encounter of a directed planet with another planet or a ray was not understood to signal an event that was synchronous with that astrological event. Instead, the directive methods were originally used as one means of establishing a series of Time Lords. the Time Lords govern blocks or spans of time, not so much moments. This is one thing that that will be difficult for modern astrologers to adjust to. Modern astrologers are so used to looking for an astrological event and find it synchronized with some event happening in the human world. The Hellenistic approach is different. It is to take the life as a whole and to break it to divide the times of life, and these periods or spans of time are under the jurisdiction of a given planet, and these spans of time can be subdivided in order to study smaller and smaller periods of time, but they are always still spans of time. And as I said, the original motivation for the directive methods was as one means to determine a sequence of Time Lords rather than to time events that are happening at one moment or another. Transits are mentioned very frequently in the Hellenistic material, but they are always understood to be subject to timing through Time Lord systems. In other words, the underlying thought is that transits that are concurrent with the onset of a new Time Lord period, a new span of time under the jurisdiction of another planet, those transits are understood to have a bearing or a significance for the entire time lordship of that planet. Planets that are concurrent with the onset of the time lordship of planets that are ruling subdivisions of those times, those transits are understood to have significance for the duration of those smaller increments of time. But it is extremely important to understand that the whole transit doctrine originated within the context of the Time Lord procedures, and were only rarely understood to be an independent means of timing. We have found that when transits are studied in this manner, their significance can be determined far more readily. It does not always have to be the case that the importance of a transit will show itself immediately at the onset of some event. It will not always have to be exactly concurrent with some event. One of the exciting things about the study of transits within the context of Time Lords is to determine when, in fact, they are particularly significant transits and when they are not. At any rate, this is just to give you a general idea of how all of the material that does survive to us can in fact be grouped together and classified under these various three headings. Now, as I said before, it is my contention that when studied in detail, all of the different Time Lord procedures, all of the different topical methods, and all of the universal techniques can be understood to be integrated with one another, so in a highly systematic and organized manner. The clue for the organization of these different doctrines into a coherent system, the clues are usually provided by the technical language that the Hellenistic astrologers used. This technical language was introduced right at the founding of the Hellenistic period. It is an amazingly interesting technical language, which on the one hand is able to refer to an astronomical event, but at the same time suggests something else, oftentimes a paradigm that belongs to sort of ordinary daily human life. I will return to this issue of paradigms after I start going through the Hellenistic manner of looking at a chart. But think paradigm for the moment, because it's one of the most incredibly important features of Hellenistic astrology. What I'm trying to say is that the Hellenistic astrological concepts, the names given to these concepts, were not merely arbitrary. the words, the language itself suggests the interpretation of the concept, the motivations behind the different steps in an elaborate technique, and so forth. And that technical language is also the means of beginning to regroup and reorganize what survives of the Hellenistic material back into what I would regard as the original form of the system. This original system does not survive intact in any one astrological text. It's scattered throughout the entire surviving corpus. Some astrologers preserve certain parts of it, other astrologers preserve other parts of it, oftentimes in accordance with their own interests in astrological practice. But the hypothesis that I am making, and we have verified this to a certain extent, is that all of this material originally belonged to one coherent, highly integrated system.